5 years after their intense but painful breakup, Leo Hale and Chris Matthews found themselves in each other's orbit once more. Chris had returned to college to finish his degree, and Leo, now an esteemed professor, had no idea his former lover would be enrolled in his class. It wasn't until the first day of class that Leo saw Chris sitting at the back of the room. His heart skipped a beat, but Leo quickly masked his shock behind professional detachment. "Chris Matthews," Leo called out during roll call, his voice tight, hiding the emotion that threatened to surface. "Here," Chris responded coolly, giving a polite nod but avoiding Leo's gaze. The familiarity of his presence caught Leo off guard, and though Chris didn't acknowledge the lingering tension between them, it was palpable. After class, both kept their distance, their interactions only confined to brief, surface-level academic exchanges. Chris seemed to have grown distant, perhaps trying to protect himself from the awkwardness, while Leo remained professional, refusing to acknowledge the flickering flame of unresolved feelings that reignited the moment they locked eyes again. Over the next few weeks, their interactions remained formal. But there were moments, brief, charged exchanges when their eyes would meet across the room, when Leo would accidentally brush against Chris while handing back papers. There were flickers of old chemistry between them, but neither was willing to confront it. Still, Chris's presence began to affect Leo in subtle ways. Leo couldn't help but notice the way Chris engaged with the other students, especially his friendliness with another teacher, Dr. Ellison. The two seemed to have an easy rapport, often staying after class to chat or discussing ideas in the faculty lounge. Leo observed them from a distance, a tight feeling growing in his chest. A few days later, after class, Chris lingered near Leo's office, as if hesitant. They didn't speak much, but the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Leo had caught a glimpse of Chris's playful banter with Dr. Ellison earlier that day, and the jealousy began to gnaw at him. Was Chris just being friendly, or was there something more despite himself? Leo couldn't shake the thought. Yet, he pushed it away. He had no right to feel this way. He had let Chris go all those years ago. The more Leo watched Chris with Dr. Ellison, the more the feeling of jealousy grew, despite the fact that there was no real reason to be suspicious. It wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. Leo didn't want Chris to think he had moved on or to realize that his feelings had never truly gone away. Chris, meanwhile, seemed to be retreating into himself. He no longer made the occasional playful comments in class, and his interactions with Leo were minimal, professional even. Leo felt Chris's distance, but he couldn't bring himself to address it. The misunderstanding remained unspoken each time Leo saw Chris and Dr. Ellison together, his heart twisted with insecurity, though he never expressed it. Then one day, Chris stayed after class again, lingering by the door as Leo gathered his things. "I was wondering if I could get some extra help on the project," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure," Leo replied, trying to sound neutral, though inside, the tension gnawed at him. He was beginning to resent the way Chris was pulling away. The issue with Dr. Ellison continued to simmer under the surface, even though nothing overt was happening. One day, Chris passed Leo in the hallway, and Leo overheard a quick exchange between Chris and Dr. Ellison, followed by laughter that, for some reason, felt uncomfortable. Leo wasn't sure if it was a genuine moment between colleagues or something more, but he couldn't shake the idea that Chris had grown close to someone else. The feeling was like a heavy weight in his chest. After that moment, Chris grew increasingly distant. Whenever he saw Leo, there was nothing more than a polite nod. His usual teasing, the subtle flirtation, the comfort they'd once shared, all of it had vanished. Leo found himself growing desperate with frustration and hurt, unable to resolve the bubbling jealousy and unresolved tension. But, despite the distance, the feelings Leo had for Chris were still there, as sharp as ever. As weeks went by, the air between them grew more suffocating. Leo could no longer ignore his feelings for Chris. His jealousy had transformed into a quiet longing, an ache that never seemed to subside. Yet, despite all the lingering emotions, neither of them ever confronted what was truly happening between them. One afternoon, Leo found himself in his office after class, sifting through papers, when Chris appeared at the door. He was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. Leo's heart skipped a beat. "Can we talk?" Chris asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. Leo nodded, but neither of them spoke for a few moments. There was tension in the silence as they tried to navigate their thoughts. Leo couldn't ignore it anymore, and neither could Chris. I don't understand what's happening between us anymore," Chris started, his voice shaky. "I've seen the way you've been acting, Leo. The way you've been watching me. I didn't want to believe it, but I thought maybe you were still upset with me." Leo swallowed hard, trying to hold back the storm of emotions. "It's not that," he replied, his voice low. "I've seen how you're close to Ellison. It made me think you've moved on." Chris blinked in surprise. "Wait, what?" He looked confused, then almost amused. "No, Leo. Nothing's going on with Dr. Ellison. We're just colleagues. That's all." Leo felt his chest tighten in relief. "You mean, all this time I've been jealous for no reason?" he asked, his voice incredulous, but there was a glimmer of something softer behind his frustration. "I guess neither of us knew how to deal with all this," Chris said with a soft chuckle. "I'm sorry I pulled away. I was trying to protect myself." Leo shook his head, stepping closer. "I've never stopped loving you, Chris. I've been so focused on everything else, but all I've done is miss you. I was too afraid to admit it." Chris stepped forward, finally closing the gap that had formed between them. "I feel the same way," he whispered. "I just didn't know how to fix it. I've been holding on to all these feelings, thinking you'd moved on." They both stood there, words finally spilling out, the misunderstandings and jealousy falling away as they faced each other honestly for the first time since their reunion. Then, Chris reached for Leo, his hands trembling slightly as they cupped Leo's face. "I've never stopped loving you either," Chris murmured before pressing his lips to Leo's in a kiss that spoke of relief and regret all at once. As their kiss deepened, the world outside disappeared. Every feeling they had buried, every moment they had distanced themselves, seemed to wash away with the tenderness of their embrace. They both knew there was more to fix. There would be bumps along the way, but the foundation of their love had never disappeared. When they pulled apart, their foreheads resting together, Leo whispered, "I'm sorry. We should have talked sooner." Chris smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from Leo's face. "It's okay. We got here in our own time." For once, everything felt right, and Leo knew they were finally ready to rebuild what they had lost. The next day, Chris showed up to class early, sitting at the back, but this time, his eyes constantly drifted toward Leo as the professor entered the room. There was an undeniable warmth in the way they looked at each other, as though everything was beginning anew. The unspoken tension was still there, but now it was something sweeter, more hopeful. Leo couldn't stop himself from sneaking glances at Chris as he walked to the front of the class. Their eyes locked a few times, and Leo was sure that his students had begun to notice the change in the air between them. For a brief moment, Leo felt self-conscious. He forced himself to focus on the lecture. But then, Chris's usual playful smile flashed as their eyes met for just a second. It wasn't the teasing smile from before, it was more genuine now, soft. And it was as if Leo's heart stopped for a moment. He glanced away quickly, but a part of him longed to close the distance and bridge everything that had been left unspoken. After class, Leo made his way to his office as usual, but just as he opened the door, he spotted Chris standing there. It was the first time Chris had waited for him outside his office, uninvited but no longer reserved. It felt like a different world than the one they had shared before. "I thought you might like some company after class," Chris said, casually leaning against the wall. Leo gave a small smile, trying to act unaffected, though his heart was racing. "I thought you were leaving." "I was," Chris said with a grin. "But you caught my attention." His playful tone was back, and Leo couldn't help but feel that familiar spark igniting. "Besides, I was just coming to see if you're free for a coffee after." "What do you say, Leo?" Leo raised an eyebrow at the boldness of Chris's invitation, but he couldn't resist. "Coffee? You just want an excuse to skip the homework, hey?" Chris chuckled, "Maybe. But mostly I'm just trying to get to know you again. I like the professor side of you, but I think I could use a bit of the Leo side." He gave Leo a knowing look. Leo smiled, shaking his head. "Fine. A coffee," he said, allowing himself to relax for a moment. "But no funny business. We're both professionals now, Chris." "I promise," Chris winked. "Well, if you say so, Professor." After their first coffee date, Leo tried to settle into his usual routine. But he couldn't ignore the way things had shifted between them. Chris's smile lingered in Leo's thoughts for longer than he'd anticipated. The air between them was no longer filled with tension, but a soft, simmering warmth. The days after their meeting passed with small, fleeting moments that marked their slow reconciliation. Leo found himself looking for excuses to talk to Chris, like answering questions after class or giving quick feedback on his assignments. There were awkward pauses, then flirty exchanges in the hallways, brief glances in the classroom. The teasing jokes and subtle touches that had once marked the early stages of their relationship resurfaced, but they were more genuine this time. One day, as Chris walked into class with that smile Leo had come to know so well, he lingered by Leo's desk before sitting down. "Good morning, Professor," Chris said, leaning over the desk with a playful wink. "You know, I think I'm starting to miss the old professor lectures. The tough love kind." Leo chuckled and responded with a raised eyebrow, "Oh, are you implying that I've been too easy on you lately? You might just be asking for a detention." Chris smirked and shrugged, clearly enjoying Leo's shift in attitude. But there was an underlying vulnerability now, something more sincere, something Leo hadn't seen before. "Well, if you're offering extra assignments, I'd be more than willing to take them off your hands," Chris teased, but Leo noticed the subtle trace of sincerity behind the playful offer. They exchanged glances for a moment longer than necessary, then Chris walked back to his seat. Leo couldn't deny it, the small interactions were rekindling something that had always been there, but something had changed. They were no longer just two people navigating through professional lines, but two people trying to find their way back to what they'd lost. Days passed, and with each encounter, their growing closeness felt like an undercurrent running through every conversation. Chris still occasionally hung around the campus after his lectures, waiting for Leo, though he no longer felt nervous or hesitant. Instead, he carried an air of certainty, as though he'd gotten used to this new dynamic between them, one that was marked by affection rather than distance. One afternoon after class, Leo happened to spot Chris on his way to the parking lot, standing near the library with a couple of friends. He paused, watching Chris chat with his peers, unaware of Leo's presence. From his spot, Leo felt the familiar pang of jealousy tighten in his chest. He hadn't imagined it. He could tell that Chris was laughing a little too brightly, especially when Dr. Ellison appeared from the other direction. Chris greeted him with a warm smile, and the brief, friendly exchange between the two teachers only made Leo feel a little more possessive. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and though he knew Chris wasn't doing anything wrong, Leo couldn't shake the discomfort that stirred inside him. But instead of stepping forward to interrupt, he took a moment to breathe, realizing that he had no reason to feel threatened. When Leo caught up to Chris moments later, walking back to the building together, the distance between them felt a little too silent. "You looked pretty cozy with Dr. Ellison today," Leo said casually, breaking the silence but with just the right hint of teasing. Chris grinned, not missing a beat. "What, jealous, Professor?" Leo smirked but didn't answer directly. He instead leaned in slightly and lowered his voice just enough for Chris to catch the hint of vulnerability behind his words. "You could have told me. You know, that things were fine. I was worried." Chris raised an eyebrow, glancing at Leo as if this was an unusual moment of honesty. "Worried?" he repeated, before a gentle smile touched his lips. "I told you, nothing is going on with anyone else." The reassurance in his tone made Leo pause. Perhaps the jealousy had been something he needed to sort through. His feelings were real, but it wasn't about other people, it was about not wanting to lose Chris again. Chris's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, Leo could see the sincerity behind his playful smirk. "Leo," he said, "I've never stopped wanting you. I just didn't know how to reach out. I thought you'd moved on." The words hung in the air, heavy and real. There was no denying it anymore. The confusion had settled into something deeper, something undeniable. Leo smiled back, feeling both lighter and more certain than before. "I've been the same idiot, haven't I?" he teased softly, shaking his head. "Never knowing when to say how I feel." Chris laughed, nudging his shoulder against Leo's in the most intimate gesture they'd shared in a long time. "Seems like we both have a habit of doing that." In the following days, they slowly became more comfortable with each other. When Leo would pass Chris in the hallway, he made no effort to hide the affectionate glance or gentle smile that naturally came to his face. And, of course, Chris always responded with the same level of warmth. Their growing relationship began with these small steps: a text sent at midnight to ask about a project, a casual lunch shared in a nearby cafe, quiet moments spent talking between classes. They took it slow, neither rushing nor forcing anything, simply letting the chemistry develop naturally as the days slipped by. The flirtation, the jealousy, the nervous excitement, everything blended together in ways that felt comfortable and familiar. About a week after their light-hearted conversation about Dr. Ellison, Leo asked Chris to meet him again, but this time not for an academic reason. They met at a park near campus, walking beside each other in a comfortable silence. The slight tension that had once lingered between them was mostly gone now. As they stopped near a fountain, Chris turned to Leo, a sincere look in his eyes. "You know, I think I finally get it. All this time I was waiting for something to change between us." "I think we both were." Leo smiled. "I've waited a long time for this," he replied softly, stepping closer. "And now I don't think I'm willing to let go again." The space between them closed, and this time, there was no hesitation. Leo leaned in, pressing his lips gently against Chris's, feeling all the unspoken emotions pour into that kiss. When they finally pulled back, they smiled at each other, understanding more than ever before. "Let us not make the same mistakes again," Chris whispered, his hand moving to intertwine with Leo's. Leo nodded. "No more running, no more distance." They stood there in the growing light, not just as former lovers or teachers and students, but as something new. And for once, Leo felt hopeful about the future.